this is the Standards Committee for Wednesday the 5th of February 2025. It's just gone 10 o'clock. Welcome everybody. Are there any absences, please?
Thank you, Chair. I've received apologies from Councillor Newton as well as Sue Gallone and Clarissa Goslin, who are two of the Council's independent persons.
Thank you very much. Have we all looked at the minutes of the last meeting from the 24th of October? And if so, can I have a proposer and a seconder for minutes? Thank you, Councillor Oxley. Thank you, Councillor Talbot. I should have said before I started who we have in the meeting. We have, if you'd just like to say hello, councillors, Councillor Morris Alexander. Are you here? Sorry? Oh, okay. I'll just say the names of the councillors. Sorry, Councillor Alexander. Councillor Alexander, Councillor Michael Talbot. Just Councillor Joe Henderson and Councillor Anne Oxley. And on my left, I have the officers that are helping us, and also two independent people, Mr. David Irvine and Mrs. Jane Watts. Thank you. Right, okay, declarations of interest. Councillor Alexander.
I would like it recorded, if I may, that I'm at present a serving member of the Planning Committee, but nothing here. I have no bias or prejudice against the agenda.
Thank you very much, and I would like to add my name to that as well. I'm on the Planning Committee as well. Anyone else? No. Thank you very much. Right, are there any questions notice pursuant to Council Procedure Rule 38? No. Thank you very much. Excellent. Now we get on to the main part of the meeting. Report of the Monitoring Officer A1, Planning Probity Protocol, the results of the consultation and revised Planning Probity Protocol, which can be pages 15 to 28. Mrs. Hastings. Thank you.
Thank you, and members of the Standards Committee. Present to you the outcome of the consultation on the revised Planning Probity Protocol, which, as the Chairman says, is page 15 of your agenda. At your previous meeting, you requested that the draft protocol that was presented to you at that meeting was, and we did some consultation with the portfolio holder for planning, which is Councillor Baker, also with planning officers, independent persons and members of the Planning Committee. The feedback was received either in writing, via email to officers, or through a workshop that we did with some members of the Planning Committee who were able to attend, together with planning officers being Gary Guyver and John Pateman G. The outcome of the consultation has been included for you. I'm just going to go to Appendix B first, which is on page 26. So what officers have done here is they have included pretty much verbatim the responses that were received to the consultation. So as the Standards Committee, you also suggested some proposals at your meeting, so those have been noted. Then you've also got the responses from Planning Committee members, planning officers and independent persons, and those were then, oh, and you've also got, sorry, on page 25, the very detailed response from the portfolio holder of housing and planning portfolio holder. So taking all of those, that feedback into account, officers have produced, and again I'm going to say it's a team effort within the directorate, of which I'm very proud of. So we have, it hasn't actually got a page number, but it starts after page 23 within your agenda. This is the revised planning probity protocol with tracked changes, so you can see the difference between what you received previously, of which I know Councillor Talbot always likes to see track changes. So just to explain, the blue text is from officers taking into account the feedback received, and they were done mainly by Joanne Fisher, who's the planning solicitor, and the red ones are my additional comments. So that was just to highlight why they're different colours. But essentially, we wanted to show you all the suggested changes. Some of the themes that came out in the consultation related to training around the protocol and site visits and determining planning applications. And what we have said is, if the planning probity protocol as revised is endorsed by yourselves, it's recommended onto full council because it sits within the council's constitution. Once adopted by full council in March, if it's approved, then we'll undertake further training with the planning committee on the probity protocol, the site visits procedure, and also as well, it is probably timely to do the determining planning applications training again. I'm not going to go through all of the changes because we'll be here for some time. You specifically asked at this committee that there was more of a link back to the code of conduct where necessary, and I've tried to incorporate those. In addition, under 2.5 onwards, I've also included some of the text from the code of conduct in relation to respect of officers. And within the body of the document as well, I've also included reference to what is known as the relationship protocol for members and officers as well, because that's an additional document which it's useful to have. As you can see, as I said, there's quite a lot of changes to the member training section, and also what happens if you are biased or predetermined with regards to participation in the meetings. So at that point, I think I'll go over to the committee, Madam Chairman, to see if anyone has any comments or questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Hastings. Councillors, yes, Councillor Talbot.
Is that just my hearing aid screaming, or
yes, that is your
everybody's?
hearing aid.
Yeah. Can you hear me if I speak? Can you hear me now? Thank you, Joe. Sharing it. I'll tell Ivan. All I want to... I read right through this. It's a magnificent report, and the way it's laid out is brilliant. As you say, I do like to know exactly where we're going. I'll tell you, it took me a couple of minutes, under 3 hours to read this, but I made a particular effort to do it. I might add, with a nice glass of beer by the side of me as I was doing it. But after I finished reading it, I thought to myself, blimey, that was worth reading. I think it's a cracking agenda we've got. I know we've got a few absentees. Obviously, I've got some questions that I wrote down at the time. One of the things I was a little concerned about, I have to look at my own little notes on here. Going back to right back at the start, page 16, where it refers to a slightly more regular treatment of officers' planning applications. The only thing that crossed my mind, on a planning application that goes before the committee and is dealt with publicly, does this actually mean that the private names and private addresses of senior officers will be disclosed to the public by way of reporting the application? Only I think that could have some problems for officers. We don't normally publish their addresses. It's not on the website or anything. But I just thought this might be a little bit far and land some of them possibly with bother. It was only a thought.
Thank you. I'll ask Mrs. Hastings. Mrs. Hastings.
So the position is currently that all officers' planning applications would go to committee. And you are correct, Councillor Talbot, in that that then does reveal the address of that particular officer. So the proposal is that rather than apply to all officers of the council, it should apply to senior officers of the council, and that all officers within planning and legal services. The reason being is that we're trying to be as open and transparent as possible. It follows standard national practice. It could be perceived that officers within planning or legal could be helping to determine their own planning applications. So it's best that they do go to committee, and I think that with regards to senior officers, in some instances we have to accept that we are placed in a situation where, you know, our details can be disclosed. We have actually in the past had a member of the public who took advantage of knowing where a particular officer lived once their information became known in a planning committee agenda, but we subsequently wrote to that member of the public and reminded them of what they should and shouldn't do. So, but we are, at the moment, it's for all officers, and what we're now trying to do is actually say it should only be senior officers across the council, but also all planning and legal officers.
Thank you, Mrs. Hastings. Can I, okay.
Obviously, we're a family, aren't we, you know, at the town hall, let's be honest. Are the officers aware of what's being proposed? I know you don't ask them for their decision, that's the committee's decision. But I just wondered if officers are aware of this and whether you could privately say whether there'd been any comment.
Mrs. Hastings.
So I haven't specifically asked all officers within planning or legal services if they wish to still have that information go to planning committee. However, that is the status quo now. That's the position now. Within our staff handbook that is given to all staff, there is a section on declarations of interest, and it does, from memory, I think, refer to the fact that this could happen. But we can definitely remind officers. But as I say, for senior officers, it already applies. So we're actually helping the majority of officers by doing this.
Thank you. Councillor Alexander.
Thank you, Chair. I must say, listening to Councillor Talbot, this does raise concern in my mind. Um, I myself am in the public domain and sat upon committees and have been approached by the general public with some pretty nasty stuff. For example, you need to die, or we know where you live. I said, that's good, because so do I. That would be my response to that. However, nothing came of that. I believe officers do a most amazing job, and last night at Planning Committee was a typical example of that, of putting the application before us and helping us through it. They do their work, so I do tend to lean on that. But I would like, if I may, Chair, from our monitoring officer, just one piece of page 15, which is in the executive summary, which is the concept of bias needs to be stronger. How, looking at this as a much bigger picture, how do we increase that concept of the bias conception, and how do we make it stronger within the bias?
Mrs Hastings.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. That's a sort of a summary of the feedback that was received during the consultation, and where it came about was that some members were that fed back through the consultation were surprised to see the concept of bias within the planning probity protocol, to which as officers we responded, well, it's always been there. But what it made us reflect upon was that maybe when we do the training for the planning committee, we tend to focus maybe more on predetermination and predisposition rather than the concept of bias. So it was really about enhancing that through the training. So we did tweak the wording a little bit in the protocol to make it a bit clearer, but it was very clear also to us that we need to bring that out more in the training.
Just,
Thank you, Mrs Hastings.
Chair, may I come back? Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That I understand that perfectly well. It's just that within that concept, I can see, and a typical example of this took place last night when a senior member of my particular party was present in the room and gave an address as the local ward member. And that would, in some cases, have an effect in the bias from that peer pressure down. Believe me, it had no pressure on me whatsoever. I go by what's written. So can you see where I'm coming from here and where the pressures and the bias comes from? There are many avenues it can inject into your daily counselling life.
Thank you. Mrs Hastings.
I can completely see the point you're making, Councillor Alexander, and actually that situation can also happen not only, I suppose, if you have a ward councillor or a leader of your political group speaking, but also as well, if you've been lobbied beforehand by members of the council or even residents or town and parish councils. So I think it's the main thing for members on the planning committee to do is to give real consideration to the way that they behave during the meeting and the things that they say, so that you are making it very clear, just almost as you have done just now, to say just keep reinforcing that you're there with that open mind and you are you are considering the application on the planning merits and the material before you, albeit you've listened to what the representations have been made. So I think it's about reinforcing your position to protect yourselves as planning committee members in the actual meeting. And if you want points recorded in the minutes, you can ask for that to be recorded. So you've also got that there as well.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. Yeah, on Appendix A, on 9.43, obviously I've never sat on the planning committee, but I have been at some of the site visits. It does state the chairman will make it clear to interested parties who are in attendance, including the applicant, agent, supporters, objectors, ward members, parish or town councillors, that they are not permitted to question or lobby planning committee members. If attempts to question or lobby a present at the site visit will be stopped. Do we, for that reason, why do we actually invite people to turn up at the site visits? You know, it's because if you turn up there and you're not able to speak or say anything, would it be easier for the planning committee if supporters, objectors weren't on those site visits? Would it actually make it easier for the planning committee?
Mrs. Hastings.
I will respond, and then maybe members that are on the planning committee could also mention about site visits. So site visits are not mandatory. They are, you do not have to have a site visit to be able to determine a planning application. Some councils do have site visits, some don't. But the guidance from the Planning Advisory Service is that if you do have a site visit, you should have very, very strict protocols in place. The reason being, almost for the picking up on the point that Councillor Alexandra made earlier, is those are planning committee members that are about to make a decision. They're going to make a decision later on that evening. So it is not that they're on a site visit to essentially see the site, you know, have things pointed out to them by officers, but it is not a forum for lobbying by town and parish councillors, the members of the public. The reason that they're invited is so that they can observe to see that it's open and transparent, you know, as well, so that they can have faith and assurance in the process. The reason there has been quite a few examples of where lobbying at site visits can put planning committee members also in very difficult situations, either with regards to health and safety, or people want to talk to them to say, you know, you should approve this or you should refuse this because. So we have to make sure we've got those procedures to protect the members of the committee and protect the decisions that this council makes. The other reason why we prevent or we want to prevent town and parish councils from speaking and taking more of a role on site visits is, you know, they are no different to members of the public in that situation. You know, they've already made their representations through the consultation exercise, and the district council needs to control its own process. You know, no disrespect to town and parish councils and councillors, but, you know, this is not their function. This is the district council's function. So, you know, they're there to observe, make sure everything's going okay. They can raise concerns afterwards if they feel that something wasn't appropriate, but it should be a controlled environment. But I'll pass over to the chairman or Councillor Alexandra if they wish to comment as they're on site visits.
I think Councillor Alexander would like to say something. Councillor Alexander. Henderson first.
Just very quickly, could I ask that perhaps a refresher be put out to the clerks of parish and town councils as to what is expected of councillors? Because an updated version say, whilst you can attend, obviously this is what we don't expect to happen, and I think that might be quite helpful to the planning committee.
Thank you. Mrs Hastings.
I'll just come back on that point. We do need to review the letter that goes out in relation to site visits, and I would say not just for town and parish councils. You know, I'd also say for the developers, you know, the applicants as well. You know, if we're doing our job properly, we should let people know what is expected and what is not tolerated beforehand, rather than reacting to it on the site. So I would hope the letter is clear, but if it isn't, you know, we'll definitely amend it to reflect that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Our tendering is quite a unique place because it's, within its capitulation it has areas of rural, industrial, but small and densely populated. It is quite a big thing, and we decided as a committee that site visits really were essential for us to get a concept. But yes, I've been certainly bullied on a site visit, and as our monitoring officer well has known, that was dealt with very swiftly. So our strength is in our chairman, and we have an excellent chairman. Yesterday was a typical example, if I may quote that, Chair, where the agent trying to help cut across the address from the officer and was given short shift over that, and then invited at the end, would you like to add something? The input from the agent was important because we learnt something we didn't already know. So if working together as a constructive team, we learn so much from these site visits, and it helps determine us facing the officers and their decision and how they arrived at that decision, and consequently we give our judgment.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander, and I would also like to say that yes, we do have a very good chairman, and they do read us the Riot Act before we go out there, and hopefully everybody does as they should do, and they don't always, and she is very on point when she does tell people what they should and shouldn't be doing. Yes, very scary. Yes, okay. Okay, independent people, have you got anything to say to that? Yes, and now Councillor Oxley.
Just a quick point. It was just about lobbying, actually, 8.1 here. Don't know what page it is, Appendix A. Lobbying is a normal and perfectly proper part of the political process. Not sure about the political. One would hope that wouldn't be political. Members of the public, applicants or local interest groups will often seek to influence. Lobbying seems to be a thing. I don't think we're ever going to stop that. The nature of the beast, I suppose. One hopes that this political process, or the word political, doesn't actually come into when we make these big decisions on planning. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Oxley. Right, anyone else got anything they would like to say on that matter? Mrs Hastings.
So just a couple of points to say that having had the fresh eyes of others reading the protocol, a couple of typos have been spotted. So just to let you know that we will have a proofread of it before it goes to full council should you approve the recommendation on page 16, which requires members of the Standards Committee to move and second.
Thank you, Mrs Hastings. Are we, Councillor Henderson, did you want to say? Okay. Thank you very much, councillors. Okay, so the recommendations are page 16. Thank you for that reminder. Right, okay. It is recommended that the Standards Committee A. notes the outcome of the consultation with members of Planning Committee, portfolio holder for housing and planning officers and the independent persons. B. Endorses the revised planning probity protocol subject to tracked changes being accepted and recommends to full council that it be adopted and incorporated into the council's constitution. C, subject to B, includes an additional recommendation to full council that the Planning Committee's terms of reference be amended to reflect the proposed seniority of officers and all officers within planning and legal services applications to be referred to the Planning Committee, and D, subject to full council's approval of the planning probity protocol, that training on the protocol forms part of the mandatory training as required by Council Procedure Rule 33.3 for members of the Planning Committee. Thank you very much, Councillor Talbot. Thank you, Councillor Alexander. And everyone else agree? Good, excellent. Thank you. Right, okay. On to our next report. Our next report of the Monitoring Officer, A2, is the Government Consultation on Strengthening the Standards and Conduct Framework, which can be found on pages 29 to 48. Thank you. Mrs Hastings.
Thank you. So you have before you a report as a result of the consultation, which is currently live on the government's website. And I should say at this point that whilst this proposal is that this would form the District Council's formal response to the consultation via the Standards Committee, any member can respond directly to the consultation, as well as any officer or member of the public. For all members, I'll ask Ian Davidson if he could provide the link in his daily update that you get if you wanted to submit a separate response. So the purpose of today is to see if we can agree a response from the Standards Committee acting on behalf of tendering District Council. So the consultation opened on the 18th of December and runs to the 26th of February. In Appendix A to the report on page 37 is a word version of the questions that are asked on the consultation, and I have, as your monitoring officer, gone through and suggested what the answers to those questions could be, as highlighted in yellow, and where you got the ability to add any red text, free text, that is in red on your agenda pack. So we can go through those shortly. So members of the committee may remember that back in 2019 there was a national review on the standards framework and a number of recommendations came out. some of those recommendations required changes to legislation, especially in relation to sanctions. The previous government responded to that review and said that they had no intention of amending the legislation at that current time, but they did propose a model code was produced by the Local Government Association, which that piece of work was done, and Tendring District Council adopted that model code. So a lot of these questions do come from that initial piece of work back in 2019. As I've said, the questions being asked do relate to matters that will require changes in legislation. So the government are requesting responses so that they can take those into account, and then we will then need proposed legislation to change those. So at this moment in time, nothing will change. We've got the current system, it remains with us, including the current sanctions. This is essentially government seeking our views. The specific proposals being consulted on which would require legislation changes, we've included as bullet points on page 29, and that would be the introduction of a mandatory minimum code of conduct for local authorities, a requirement that all councils convene formal standards committees to make decisions and publish outcomes on formal investigations. We do that anyway. We've done that without requiring legislation to do that, but not all councils do. They are proposing the introduction of a power for local authorities to suspend councillors and mayors for serious breach of code of conduct, and as appropriate, interim suspension for the most serious and complex cases that may involve police investigations, a new category of disqualification for gross misconduct, and subject to a sanction of suspension for more than once in a 5-year period, and a role of a national body to deal with appeals. So I'll also say, for those of us that have been around for a longer period of time, some of this was in place before, and it was removed through the Localism Act 2011. So some of this is going back to a previous regime, or similar to a previous regime, should I say. It is fair to say that at the time when the government removed this power for local authorities to have suspension as a sanction, it was felt by the current government, the government at that time, that it was being abused politically across the country, and there was various examples of that, even quite locally. So that was why those powers were removed. So if they are reintroduced, there, you know, for me as a monitoring officer, I think there are times when it would be appropriate to suspend a member following a serious breach of a sanction, as a sanction, but it would, you know, we would have to be ensuring that it was used appropriately, and, you know, reserved for those most serious cases. So that's my sort of point on that. The introduction to the consultation on the website was quite interesting for me to look at, because it really wanted comments from members of the public that had gone through this process and had felt that it hadn't really helped them, and that they'd possibly been a victim of harassment or something, you know, which I think shows that whilst we don't have those issues locally, there are matters nationally which need to be addressed. So skipping to the actual appendix, which is on page 37. I could either go through the questions one by one or leave it to members to ask if they've got any comments on any of the proposed responses.
Thank you, Mrs. Hastings. Which would you rather do? Do you want to go through it point by point, or do you want to just give your thoughts? Yeah, you can't hear. No, it's not on.
Sorry.
Oh, it's on now.
Thank you. I do apologise humbly. I'll read it again. I've read the questions and I'm happy to wait till the final consultation document and the final decision has been made. I believe that that I need to ask one or two things on the executive summary just to help me push through the questions. But I get any questions, I'll return to the monitoring officer for advice.
Okay. Would you like to ask those questions now, Councillor Alexander?
Am I still on? I don't trust this thing. I've got to be honest with you, I'm actually quite in favour of this document as it's been printed and the questions that have rolled out afterwards. I haven't filled this in yet or looked at it with sincere eyes, but I will be doing that. Lisa, and I'll send this on to you without fail. I've seen so many times that people who have done something which is pretty beastly have literally walked away, and we've had one recently who totally refused to cooperate with us. So our part are very muted in this respect. But, and this is the but, we must understand that we could be sitting here in the morning into this evening, we could be sitting in a room with the very person who we've just been talking about. So there could be ramifications. So that needs to be handled with kid gloves, because if our decisions are going to be stronger, we will need some kind of a wraparound to ensure that we are not singled out by any one particular individual. Now, those are the ones that I particularly wanted to say, and that's it, Chair, if I may.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Councillor Talbot.
Thank you. I must admit, Lisa's introduction covered something that I felt was trying to be withheld from the committee. You read through the report, and nowhere does it mention that the power to disqualify used to exist. And this was one of the authorities that abused that. And that's why the government removed it in the Localism Act in 2011. And the example here is it was sufficiently used to actually change the council in terms of who ran our council. In 2000, I'm going back a while, in 2007, the Conservatives who controlled the council for the last number of years, I think since 98, lost control by one vote, and a group together, like we've got now, all the other parties, which jokingly we always used to call the ABC Alliance, anything but Conservative, the letters stood for, took control. And on that occasion, in 2009, that was after 2 years of that administration, very carefully done and quite constitutionally correct, the opposition, who were, of course, the Conservative Party, managed through our standards arrangements and picking the time very carefully to do so, managed to get one of our members suspended. And that member who was suspended, I know I won't mention his name now because I know this is being recorded, but we probably know who it was. And that was enough for us in those years. you didn't start a council term and elect the leader and so on for 4 years. It was done every single year then. So when we went to the election of the year in 2009 for the leader of the year, we lost the vote by the one vote of the member who'd been dismissed, and we lost control of the council. When I say we, that was because I'm an independent. That was because I was in the ABC alliance, and we lost control of the council. They then appointed the mayor and appointed the leader and changed the constitution to suit themselves. So that was one of the things which, when reported to the government, the outcome, that the government took into account that was clearly manoeuvred, although it was manoeuvred quite legally and properly, actually with advice, I do believe, to one party from the county council, but I must delete that from what I'm saying. The time was picked very carefully, and it resulted in a change of control. And the government said, that's not what suspension of a member is intended for. And I was going to go in and have a little go and blame our officers for trying to withhold that from us. But Lisa, in her introduction, covered it full and fairly. It was always a power that local authorities could use. Our authority had it and used it. The government thought, with other examples around the country, that it was being abused, and for that reason it was suspended in the Localism Act 2011. That particular power was suspended. So all I would say, I think we find ourselves at this moment in time where on another area of our business, we've issued certain instructions and suggestions at the conclusion of a case which the individual member has chosen to totally ignore. We may well have found that to have an additional power to be able to say when we next look at that, well, this member clearly deserves suspension for a period of time. That would be a most useful power. And also, of course, the ability to withhold the member's allowance for the period of the suspension. So all I would say is I am actually totally in favour of the restoration of the power to suspend, but I really do think that if it's going to be introduced, there must be some sort of arrangement, like in other services we call the ombudsman, for an ombudsman to be able to examine the legitimacy of a suspension if a member complains it's been unfairly applied. In other words, we must stop authorities like ourselves, if we wanted to, most unfairly suspending a member for something that was quite trivial, and we should be ashamed of ourselves for having done so. We're not in that position, but I think knowing that there's an ombudsman to back it up, so that would be a suggestion of mine, certainly, that if the power to suspend is introduced in new legislation, then it should be accompanied by the provision of an ombudsman service to investigate the legitimacy of a suspension if the member suspended felt the suspension was unfair. So that great mouthful having been said, colleagues, it's ancient history now, but at the moment we're effete, aren't we? We have no powers really to do anything. All we can do is we can slap you on the wrist once, or we can slap you on the wrist twice. That's about as far as our disciplinary procedures go. And quite frankly, it makes the whole exercise ridiculous if the member at the end of the day is minded, if you like, not to eat a little bit of humble pie and send an apology to members for his actions, which he might claim has been deemed by others to have been unfair or improper. But we're in a position where we go nowhere. All we can do is, as we will do, report to the council that the actions proposed in the result of a case have not been obeyed. Now, I don't know, I know we might have a little discussion about that later, perhaps, but I would fully support what's being said here. But I would add that caveat that I feel that if we are going to have the power to suspend, then there must be a method to defend the member, because we're not a political council. We have the parties, but we don't argue very much on political lines. But some of the councils I've been on in London before, mate, you could almost shoot the bloke opposite if he disagreed with you. The argument was that violent. So, you know, ours isn't a typical authority. Ours is a gorgeous authority to work for. Everybody can be friends, whatever party they are. But I've known it where people wouldn't dare almost cross the line, the two swords length or whatever it is in the House of Commons. So forget all that. I know it's a lot of waffle, but at the same time, it's a necessary power to introduce. We must give councils in the country and standards committee investigating complaints a power more than just the use of words. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Councillor Talbot. Councillor Oxley.
I feel very strong about this as well. I would certainly reiterate exactly what Councillor Talbot has said. I'm sure we all feel that we've gone so far, there's nothing else that we can do, and you can hold your hands up high and say, could we have done any more? No, we couldn't. We've got a monitoring officer that has taken us every step of the way, and it's an excellent report. But I feel very strong that if there is anything in the foreseeable future that this council can do, then we should certainly look into it and carry on from that. Just quickly on something else, on page 29, which says, in addition, the consultation seeks views on how to empower victims affected by councillor misconduct to come forward and what additional support would be appropriate to consider. Have we looked into what kind of support we would give to maybe a local councillor that's bringing something forward? Thank you for that.
Thank you, Councillor Oxley. Mrs Hastings?
In this proposed response, I've said that because we're responding as an organisational body, it wouldn't apply to us, because this particular question is aimed at those individuals that have been the victim of that behaviour. So because we're doing a corporate response, we haven't, but if any, as I said at the outset, if any member or officer or member of the public wishes to respond to this, you know, please do so, because they are seeking views.
Thank you, Mrs Hastings. Councillor Henderson, did you want to say anything? No? Okay, that's lovely. Independent people.
I would just say that I'm in favour of the proposed changes. I feel that everybody put in so many hours of their time for it to just be ignored just seems wrong.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, if I could just ask the question, this situation with suspensions for political reasons, should not suspensions always go through the Standards Committee, and does the consultation cover that?
Yes. Mrs Hastings. Thank you.
Yes. So, but I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to find the bit for you where it says that. So it's page 41, at the very bottom, question 18, says that, do you think local authorities should be given the power to suspend? My proposed response is yes. And then the next question is, do you think it's appropriate for a standards committee to have the power to suspend members, or should this be the role of an independent body? My proposed response is that it should sit with the Standards Committee. Although I have added some red text, which I just want to, I was going to bring this up, I just want to slightly amend it because I don't think it's as clear as it could be. What I would like to just insert some words at the beginning, and I'll explain first what I mean, is that my view as your monitoring officer is that that decision should be made by the local standards committee. However, if as a result of the consultation, the government decided that it should go to an independent body to be determined, my request is, to suppose to the government, is that we need to understand how that's going to work practically, because these things take time. So if we had a standards committee and the decision was to impose a sanction of suspension, but we then had to refer it to an independent body for that decision, one, how long is that going to take? Two, that will involve council resources managing that process, and also as well, so there could be a delay and it could increase our resources, and also as well, the member would still remain in place, but the committee have decided it's so serious that they should be suspended. So my point is, if you are going to do that, government, can you just let us know how you think it's going to work in practice? So my additional wording was going to, if I just read it afresh, was, although we feel it should remain with the Standards Committee, but in the event that the outcome of the national consultation supports suspension, teeth in, being referred to an independent body, it is unclear how a referral to an independent body would work in practice, could create and increase council resources to manage the process. So that's the point I wanted to make. It just wasn't quite clear when I first drafted it. The other thing I was going to ask is, I believe Karen's got the figures for the breakdown of those different types of complaints for question 13A, page 40. So we can have those so they can be inserted.
Chair,
Mrs.
could the monitoring officer repeat the question numbers, please? I didn't quite catch them.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, it's question 13A, and Karen Hayes has got the break. At the moment, we've just got X's, and Karen's actually got the breakdown there, so she's going to give those figures for us so they're recorded for our consultation response.
Mrs. Hayes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So just the breakdown, we've covered the periods 21-22, 22-23, 23-24 and 24-25 up until now. Obviously, we haven't completed that year yet, though. And complaints received have been 10 from elected members, 5 from co-opted members and 22 from the public. It's worthy of note, though, that a couple of the public complaints are from ex-co-opted members, so recently resigned from their position, but we've then classed them as public. That's at the time that we've received the complaint. So I hope that provides a bit of clarification.
Complaints made by officers nil? No.
None. Thank you very much, Mrs. Hayes. Mrs. Hayes. That's very interesting, isn't it? Yes, of course, Mrs. Hayes.
I'm just going to come back on the question that Councillor Talbot asked about complaints from officers being none. We do occasionally have situations where an officer does feel slightly aggrieved by the way they've been treated by a member. In those instances, the first thing we do with myself and Ian Davidson as the Chief Executive and Head of Paid Service, we would request a meeting with that member, and we would speak to that member. And in all the situations we've had, and there haven't been many, but it has resulted in a compromise position that everybody has been happy with. That isn't to say that, mainly it's apologies, maybe it's a misunderstanding of facts, information, but it's better for, we feel, for members and officers to come together and rebuild relationships rather than go through an investigation process. Having said that, though, if there was a case which that was not appropriate to do, we wouldn't do it. It's so. I just want to make it clear that there are instances where we have to have those discussions, but they normally get resolved quite quickly. And sorry, I was listening to the debate you were having about the power of suspension, and if you don't mind, Madam Chairman, I could suggest to you an additional recommendation as C. I'll read it out, and then you might not wish to do so, but the feeling in the room was quite strong on this. So I'll just... So the recommendation would be A, considers the contents of the report and agrees a formal response should be provided on behalf of Tendering District Council to the government's consultation exercise, and subject to A, determines to submit the proposed response as set out in Appendix A as amended through the debate at the meeting, and C, I would suggest that you could add the power of suspension should be returned to local authorities to reinforce the importance of upholding breaches of the Code of Conduct, but should not be used for political purposes and with the ability for an appeal. If you were happy with that, that could be added to your recommendations.
I think that's a yes from everybody on the committee. I think that the independent people would agree as well as on that point as well. So we'll add the third point to it. Hang on, Councillor Talbot. You've already put your hand up.
Okay, fine. Fantastic. I agree entirely. That's a very good amendment to that. So, Chair, I have been listening intently to this, and although my role in the legal profession was right away at the very bottom, I do see something here which maybe the monitoring officer can help me out with. One, that when I represent anyone, there's no bias at all. I don't know these people. I'm just appointed to go there. I listen, I read, and I take on board what it's got to be said at the time. Maybe as a supportive person, maybe as a decision maker in certain situations. But through the whole of it, there is no personal attachment. Now, this is one thing that I see that we're going to need quite a substantial amount of training to understand this principle by which you go in. At the last hearing we had here, I entered that hearing with that frame of mind. That person I knew personally, but I didn't know him at all. He was just, the evidence was what I was looking at. So there is that. And the other thing is, should we make a decision to suspend, there's nothing within the concept of this, or the content of this, for an appeal. would they be able to appeal against our decision? And if so, how would that appeal take place?
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Mrs. Hastings?
There is a question about appeal. I'm just trying to find it because oh, that's it. Yeah, page 46, question 38, at the very bottom. Do you think there is a need for an external national body to hear appeals? I've said yes. An external appeals body would help to uphold impartiality. And then it says, there's the free text box. I've suggested that it may be appropriate to use the first tier tribunal. That is a body that does hear appeals for administrative type decisions, you know, property matters, compensation matters. So I'm suggesting that. There are some proposals through different organisations and forums that have been discussing this consultation response as to whether it should be the local government and social care ombudsman that hears appeals. My view, and I'm going to come from the point of view as being a qualified solicitor, is that I don't think the ombudsman would be necessarily set up to determine those types of appeals, because I feel they could get quite legalistic. You know, you are taking, in theory, someone's right away to do something, you know, continue to act as a councillor for a period of time. So for me, it felt that the first tier tribunal would be more appropriate than the ombudsman. I don't know if, Keith, you would like to comment dealing with the ombudsman?
Mr. Simmons?
Thank you, Chair. I think that the suggestion about the first tier tribunal is a sensible one, and I think trying to extend the work of the ombudsman, the general ombudsman that is, into this field would seem to be a stretch too far for me. So,
thank you. Oh, okay. Does that answer your question, Councillor Alexander?
Yes, thank you. I did read question 38, but I wanted to expand on that because I wanted to get a fuller, robust answer, and you answered that admirably. Isn't there some talk at the moment of watering down the Ombudsman's powers? I read it somewhere online. That might be an interesting point.
Mrs. Hastings?
I haven't seen or heard that, Councillor Alexandra, but my view, for what it's worth, and it's a personal view, it's not on behalf of Tendring District Council, but I would say that the Ombudsman power should be extended to cover town and parish councils, because that way we wouldn't get as many complaints about behaviours, because more often than not it's about town and parish councils' decisions and there's no oversight of them, especially with devolution and local government reorganisation on the horizon. If we're going to give more powers to town and parish councils, they need an oversight body.
Thank you, Mrs. Councillor Talbot, I believe you had a question or a statement.
I was only going to say at the time, after Karen gave us the figures, that in some respects they're not strictly comparable, are they? The three lots of figures we've been given, because as Lisa said, the complaint that might be made internally never becomes a formal complaint, whereas we do have a procedure for complaints made against elected members, where one of the first stages, I do believe somewhere, but correct me if I've got it wrong, but I think we have a discussion with that member and his group leader to see if there's anything we can do to resolve the problem so it doesn't become a formal complaint. Have I got that right, Lisa? Just nod or whatever.
Thank you. Mrs Hastings.
I'll speak so people can hear me. The we record figures formally when a complaint form is submitted. So if a complaint form is submitted, it's counted. If we were, like the example I used earlier, where an officer was to approach us and say, not happy, if they didn't put a formal complaint in, it wouldn't be registered. However, if they did, and we have had some, going back a few years now, then they would have been included. So it's more about how many complaint forms are received, I suppose.
I'm just concerned, I think, like the monitoring officer is, that when things go to appeal, that it goes on, and that potentially if the member that's being complained against is taking it quite aggressively, he can continue to be a member. But I'm just wondering, in the event of an appeal, would the existing suspension that, for example, the committee, the standards committee, have applied, whether that includes a suspension or loss of allowances, would that still apply? Or I think it should, if that member wants to go to an appeal, it could go on for years, and I think that's not a good idea.
Thank you. Mrs Hastings.
It will depend on what the legislation says, first of all. But I will compare it to other situations where I'm thinking, say, a licensing decision, where when it's appealed, sorry, I have to keep doing, where when it's appealed, the decision is sort of suspended itself. So that's correct, isn't it? Yeah, just checking. Yeah, that's correct. So, and that's because of natural justice, isn't it? That if somebody feels that the wrong decision was made, they have a right to appeal. They can go and exercise that. So it will depend on what the legislation says. Is the overall answer. There was a proposal in the consultation to have what's called interim suspension while an investigation is ongoing. My view was no, that shouldn't be used. There are things, if it was a serious case and the councillor was part of a political group, and I say political group under the definition of the regulations, then you could have a word with the group leader, and they could be removed of committees and things, and that's what happened with the case that we had last year. I don't believe interim suspension would be appropriate pending investigation.
Mrs Hastings. Okay. To come back.
Yeah, if I'm sure it does depend on the legislation, and I'm no expert on the legislation, you are. But the argument is sort of like someone being found guilty by a jury, in this case a committee, being sent to jail, then submitting an appeal. They don't immediately get released because they put an appeal in.
Mrs Hastings.
I think that's the difference between civil and criminal. I'd like to think that if any of our councillors would not get themselves into that situation, but that's what the difference. That's you've got a civil regime, you've got a criminal regime, you've got different burdens of proof, and again, the legislation isn't there yet. We don't know what it's going to say. So, but you can feel free to send your own consultation response in and make the points that you wish to make.
Thank you, Mrs. Hastings. Right, if if any councillors haven't got any more to say, shall we go to the recommendation, if you agree? Can we have a mover and seconder to go to the recommendation? Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Thank you.
Go to the vote.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Sorry, Councillor Alexander. Okay. It is recommended that the Standards Committee A considers the contents of the report and determines whether a formal response should be provided on behalf of Tendring District Council to the government's consultation exercise, and B, subject to A, determines whether to submit the proposed response as set out in Appendix A or as amended through its debate at the meeting, and the monitoring officer.
And C was the power of suspension should be returned to local authorities to, I'm going to say it's recommend that Standards Committee agrees that the power of suspension should be returned to local authorities to reinforce the importance of upholding breaches of the Code of Conduct, but should not be used for political purposes with the ability for an appeal.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Seconder. Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Right, okay.
Sorry, did you go through the vote?
Yes.
Yes.
Everyone agrees, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Okay, now we're on to the number 7, which is report of the monitoring officer, A3 Standards Committee, review of the standards hearing procedure, which this time will be taken by Mrs. Hayes. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members and IPs. This report is to cover the review of the standards hearing procedure. This was first approved under the standards framework by full council in November 2013 and taken on by the hearing committee in 2014. We then had a hearing in May 2024, so quite some time's passed since that was utilised, so it felt appropriate before that hearing to have a review and make sure best practice and the contents are up to date. That was done and subsequently adopted by the Standards Committee at their April 24 meeting. Post the May 24 hearing, it felt like a very good opportunity for members, independent persons and officers to be able to review the hearing procedure and reflect back on the process. This was held in 2 sessions. Great discussion was generated between all members of the workshop, so to speak. And on page 53, you will see the common themes that arose from those meetings. I think the hearing procedure was fit for purpose throughout and worked well, but there are just some elements that we can strengthen and make a little more robust and just a bit more user-friendly, perhaps. You'll see when you look at the recommendations that Lisa and I are asking for a little more to be added to our workload, because upon reviewing the hearing procedure, we feel it would again be a good opportunity and tie in nicely to also review the complaints procedure as they run in parallel with each other, and also to produce a flow chart as to what happens from the complaint being determined to go to a hearing and the process after that. Happy to take any questions, and I think that Lisa might add a couple of points to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Mrs. Hastings.
Thank you. Mrs Hayes. So I just wanted to add that, as you can see through the report in front of you, following the last committee where it was suggested that this informal sort of feedback session was undertaken on the hearing procedures, that we felt as officers that it would be right and proper to bring that back to the formal committee for you, in effect, to endorse the types of feedback that were received. The other thing is, as well, as Mrs Hayes has highlighted, that we have a hearing procedure process which was followed, was included within the Standards Committee agenda for the 16th of May. Robust, nothing wrong with it. But the feedback relates to the procedure in between, prior to the hearing actually taking place. And we need to amend the council's complaints procedure to pick up on some of that feedback, but also as well, as Mrs Hayes has said, we do feel that we need something of almost like practical use with regards to, you know, so the complainant will know, subject member will know, investigator will know, officers will know what happens in between and who does what. So it's more around that. And if your members are happy with that approach, then we'll bring back some revised documentation to the next meeting.
Thank you, Mrs Hastings. Do councillors agree with that? Okay. Independent people? Yes. Lovely. So we'll go to the recommendation. Do we have a proposal for the recommendation? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. The recommendation. It's recommended that the Standards Committee A, notes the contents of this report and endorses the proposals as set out. B, requests that officers further review the Council's complaints procedure, proposes amendments as necessary and produces a flowchart detailing the process following an investigation being concluded to referral for hearing where evidence of a breach has been found. And C, requests that officers then present a revised Council's complaints procedure, standards hearing procedure and flowchart to a future meeting of the Council.
Yeah, I'll move.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Talbot. Thank you, Councillor Oxley. Thank you very much.
To the vote.
Oh, I thought we had.
You did move it. All in favour?
All in favour. Everyone. Sorry. Okay. Number 8 on our agenda is the complaints update, which can be found on pages 61 and 62. Oh, Mrs Hayes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is to provide members with an update on councillor complaints. Since the last meeting of the committee, we have received 4 new complaints. That brings us to 9 complaints during 24-25. And since the last update, 1 case is resulting in code of conduct training being conducted by the monitoring officer. 1 remains being investigated by an externally appointed investigator. A further case has been appointed to an internal investigator. 5 were closed with no further action and 1 remains ongoing. Also, during this reporting period, the monitoring officer has granted 8 requests for dispensation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs Hayes. Mrs Hastings.
Thank you. The update on page 61 of your agenda, the first item is following the hearing that we had last May, and it says in the comments column that in presenting this item I will present options available to the committee. So there, the update from the last meeting is that the chairman of the Standards Committee did write to Councillor Turner and requested that he complied with the recommendations and decision of the Standards Committee made on the 16th of May, and that expressed some disappointment that that had not been followed up despite communications being sent to him by myself, including the fact that officers within the team had organised training, but we have had no response whatsoever. The letter also gave Councillor Turner the opportunity to speak to one of the independent persons that had not been involved in the hearing process, to see if that could help and move things along. As I say, we've not had any response at all. So the situation we find ourselves in is that following your committee decision on the 16th of May, you reported to full council in a decision that the appointment to committees and outside bodies should not be provided by the full council or the leader until such time as that apology was issued to members of the special interest group, the Local Government Association's Coastal Special Interest Group, and also the training had been undertaken. That was your recommendation, and as is normal practice, the minutes of this meeting go to full council, as does a separate report informing full council of the decision. At that meeting, full council noted it. So they didn't actually make any additional decision, they noted it. Paragraph 8 of the Members' Code of Conduct, the Local Government Association's Members' Code of Conduct, which this council has adopted, makes it clear that where sanctions recommended following finding of a breach of code of conduct are not complied with, then that is considered to be an ongoing breach of the code of conduct. However, the only body that can determine that there has been a breach of the code of conduct is this committee, and it can only be done once a formal complaint is received and we go through the council's complaints procedure process. To depart from that would be inappropriate, and you know, we've got a robust procedure, it's there, it should be followed. Now, having said that, a complaint could be submitted and referred for investigation. A complaint would not take long to investigate because the facts speak for themselves. However, that is what has to happen. And then it would have to come back to this committee to have a hearing. And in the interim, I suppose we could get to a situation where the matter is resolved because the things that the committee have asked to be done are actioned. So that is an ability that could happen. So that is one option, and complaints can be submitted by officers, members, you know, or independent persons. Yeah, they could, you know, members of the public, officers, members, independent person could put a complaint in. My personal view is that I, to my sort of core, that my values are integrity, and that we must uphold and promote high standards of conduct, and that failure to comply with the outcome of this standards committee, you know, could be perceived as a continuing bringing the council into disrepute. But as you have highlighted earlier, through consideration of the consultation response to government, there are limited sanctions available. And to continue or to promote, I suppose, or encourage another complaint coming forward will use up this council's precious resources and capacity to deal with that. I have an alternative solution that you might want to consider, and that is that this standards committee, you've tried reaching out to Councillor Turner through the chairman, that's not worked. So therefore you can, as a standards committee, move a recommendation back up to full council, which is your parent body in effect, because you're fulfilling the responsibilities that full council has delegated to you to deal with non-executive functions, that you could move a recommendation along the lines of, and you know, I've drafted something that I could read out to you, but I'll explain it to you first. You know, essentially what you'd be saying is to full council that you made the decision in May. There was a finding of breach of code of conduct. You requested 2 sanctions. They've not been complied with. Councillor Turner has not responded to the communication from the chairman of the standards committee or myself. You tried to reach out to the Councillor Turner as not informally, in effect, which is to of no avail. To highlight to the full council that failure to comply with the sanctions recommended by the standards committee following a finding of breach of the code of conduct continues to be a breach as per our code of conduct. However, the standards committee does not believe that further council resources should be engaged in this matter, but remains disappointed that the breaches continue. Therefore, you request full council to formally agree with your decision of the 16th of May that whilst training and the apology remains outstanding, Councillor Turner should not be allocated committee membership or represent this council on any outside bodies, as his behaviour continues to undermine the high standards of conduct that this council expects from its elected members. Therefore, what would happen is, if you wanted to do that or something similar, it would go to full council as a recommendation. It would not just be included within the minutes of the, it would be a separate item. It would go as a report. That would have to be moved by the chairman of the committee, and then it would be for full council to receive that almost as like a motion, debate it and decide whether it agrees with that or not. Within the current regime on sanctions, personally, my professional advice to you is that's the best you're going to get. You are reporting it to full council. You've tried as a standards committee to do your job that full council has asked you to do. So you are reporting back up that, you know, you've gone as far as you can, and then, you know, it's for them to make a decision that, in effect, that they ratify or endorse your decision. Because if following a Widdicombe review, of seats on committees, and there was the opportunity for a non-aligned member, of which Councillor Turner is, to be allocated a seat on the committees. At the moment, that could happen, you know, and it's a full council decision, that could happen. But your recommendation to full council was that that didn't happen until a complaint, an apology was received, or the training undertaken. Now, Councillor Turner can decide he doesn't want to do the training, doesn't want to issue an apology. That's his gift to, you know, to make up his own mind. But then you as a committee need to decide, well, what's the ongoing consequence of that? So this proposal that I'm putting forward for you picks up on the strong messages that you have said in this committee before. You don't want the role that you have to be undermined, and you do have the ability to report it up to full council as an issue. So that's there for you to consider. I'll leave it up to now members, and then if you wish me to do anything else, amend anything, you know, I can do so.
Thank you, Mrs. Hastings. Members? Yes, Councillor Alexander.
Yes, I'm very grateful for your input there and what you have devised on our behalf. It doesn't only affect what took place at the hearing and those present at the hearing, but there are others out there who were offended by what took place, and they have had no resolve to this either. So it's not just a matter of us as a committee who are not satisfied with our response. I think in part to remove some part of that delegation from us, although we will be an active part of that bigger process in full council if we agree this. I think it's really important that if we're going to have this decision by our peers in this case, that we should give them the opportunity to be able to do that. So yeah, I'm very much in favour of that. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander.
Yeah.
Councillor Talbot.
Yeah, I was only going to say, just echo everything Maurice said. That's the way forward. I've tried to rack my brains. I know Nick. We both joined the council on the same day. You know, he's a good friend. I consider him politically. But you know, all you really ask the chap to do, let's say what it is in sort of human terms, eat a little bit of humble pie and say, all right, mates, I don't agree, I think that was just me, but that's what the committee have said. Others have taken objection to it, and I've been asked to apologise to you. So if I've offended any member, in the name of Tendring District Council, I give you a sincere apology for the behaviour that was considered by the Standards Committee. That's virtually what we've asked him to do. Write a note like that, you know, send it round by email or whatever, and also to meet formally to just, if you like, go through the conduct procedure or whatever we call it. A little formal meeting, almost like a trading thing, but you say that with a smile on your face when a bloke's been here 26 years. I'm sorry, Ed. I feel sorry for Nick. You know, we're not still being recorded, are we? We are. Oh, right. I won't say any more.
Thank you, Councillor Talbot. Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, I'm happy to go with Lisa's guidance. I think it's the best way forward on what we're going to achieve.
Thank you. Councillor Oxley?
Exactly that. I think we need to make a stand. Otherwise, it's, I don't say it's egg on our face, but as a Standards Committee, we've done all we can do. And I think with Lisa's guidance, it needs to be raised at full council. Thank you.
I agree also.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Irving. So,
Okay, so, thanks. It will be something like this. Following the outcome of the hearing on the 16th of May 2024, the Standards Committee made a decision on sanctions as a result of the Code of Conduct, of the members' Code of Conduct, being breached by Councillor Turner. 2 of these sanctions have not been complied with, being issuing an apology to members of the Local Government Association's Coastal Special Interest Group and full council, and undertaking training organised by the Monitoring